Welcome back to another youth culture screencast, and in this video we're going to focus on ethnicity and youth cultures, with a particular emphasis on the enormous influence that Jamaican street culture has had on British youth culture. Now remember, in the previous screencast we analysed the Marxist approach to the study of youth cultures, an approach that came to be known as the critical cultural studies approach. And this perspective laid down the foundations for the early study of British youth subcultures. And remember, this was a perspective that argued that we could interpret working class youth subcultures as a form of resistance, as a symbolic way of rebelling against the unfairness of capitalism. Now, despite its influence, the critical cultural studies approach has been heavily criticised by other sociologists. For example, Stanley Cohen argues that a big problem with this particular approach is it reads meanings into the behaviour and appearance of young people which the young themselves might not recognise. So Cohen argues that there's a tendency amongst such theorists to interpret the behaviour of young people as a form of class resistance, even when such behaviour might simply be an expression of a dominant commercialised culture. Another major problem with the critical cultural studies approach is its concern with exotic and rebellious youth, what some writers have called spectacular youth subcultures. And therefore this is an approach that doesn't consider the experiences of the majority of ordinary youth who are never members of youth subcultures or simply adopt subcultural styles because they are fashion rather than an expression of genuine rebellion and resistance. And therefore we could argue that although the critical cultural studies approach might provide some insight into spectacular youth subcultures, it's not representative of the majority of young people. And also with its emphasis on youth subcultures such as the skinheads, there's a focus primarily on the experiences of white working class males at the expense of other groups. In other words, the role of ethnic minority groups, the role of women, are often invisible in this critical cultural studies approach. And this is something that we're going to try to rectify in the next two screencasts. Now, in the previous two videos, we've seen that one way of understanding why young people join youth cultures is to see them as a collective solution to some of the problems that young people experience in society due to their structural position. For example, we saw that functionalists see youth cultures as a collective attempt to deal with the problems of a long and drawn-out transition into adulthood. In other words, they argue that youth cultures give young people a sense of belonging and identity whilst they're in this limbo state in between childhood and adulthood. And in our last video we saw that the Marxist approach also argued that young people from working class backgrounds join youth cultures as a way of trying to resolve some of their structural problems. So the clothing, the hairstyles adopted by working class youths were designed to shock and were designed to create a sense of symbolic power that compensated for the wearer's lack of real power in a capitalist society. Now, in a similar vein, Hebdige argues that black African Caribbean youth have also created distinctive youth subcultures as a way of dealing with the problems that they have faced. For example, he argues that black youth subcultures developed as a way of dealing with the problems of racism and discrimination. Now, the rest of this screencast will attempt to discuss the huge influence of African Caribbean culture on the development of British youth culture. Now, this image that you can see over here is of a boat called the Empire Windrush, and this boat arrived at Tilbury Harbour on the 22nd of June 1948, carrying 492 passengers from Jamaica who were wishing to start a new life in the United Kingdom. So the passengers, people like these guys, were the first large group of African Caribbean immigrants into the UK after the Second World War. And this is a really important watershed moment in the development of British youth culture. And this is because the majority of youth styles since the 1950s have been influenced by immigrant cultures, particularly Jamaican culture, which has had a huge unparalleled influence on British youth culture. Now, in the initial post-war phases of immigration from the Caribbean, the first generation migrants adopted smart and largely conventional dress, which reflected their aspirations to succeed in Britain. But they brought with them things like ska music, which was to have a big influence on British youth subcultures, such as the skinheads. But by the 1970s, the disappointments that stemmed from racism, from police harassment, and from high levels of unemployment began to be expressed in the clothes, the music, and subcultural styles adopted by a second generation of black African Caribbean youth. So distinctive black youth subcultures emerged in the UK as a result of the experiences of a second generation of black African Caribbean young people who were born and raised in Britain and yet felt that they were being socially and economically marginalised by the wider white society on the basis of their race. So the guy that you can see on this slide is a very famous British African Caribbean dub poet called Linton Kwesi Johnson, who was a young man in the 1970s. And he describes himself as being part of a rebel generation of black youths who refused to tolerate the things that their parents had tolerated in the 1950s and 1960s when they'd first arrived in Britain. So this was a new generation of black youth born in Britain who were no longer going to put up with racism and harassment from the police. Now in the 1970s, reggae music and Rastafarianism were key cultural resources that black youth used to develop their own distinctive subcultures. And these were cultural resources that could enable black youth to resist racism by embracing an Afrocentric identity. So the key themes of Rastafarian style and reggae music were resistance to the dominance of a white culture, known as Babylon, and the expression of pride in a black identity. Now perhaps the most familiar feature of Rastafarian culture is the growing and wearing of dreadlocks, so uncombed, uncut hair, which is allowed to knot and mat into distinctive locks. Now the appearance of dreadlocks in British youth subcultures can be traced back, I think, to the 1952 Mau Mau revolt in Kenya. So the Mau Mau were a people within Kenya who were trying to resist British colonial rule. And the leaders of this particular group wore dreadlocks. So the Rastafari emulated the Mau Mau both in their appearance and also their resistance to white culture. So writers like Savanadan have argued that black youth subcultures within Britain were a continuation of a colonial struggle transposed to Britain. So he argues that the black youth subcultures were driven by their opposition to capitalism and to racism. And the response of the media, predictably, was to criminalise these distinctive subcultures. So in the 1970s, black youth became folk devils for contemporary British society. They were demonised and scapegoated for many of the perceived problems of that particular era. Now we'll explore some of the political and religious themes of Rastafarianism in more detail in class. But this was an approach that rejected white Western culture, so it rejected things like consumerism and materialism. This was a culture that had themes that were overtly political and religious. Reggae music, which was the soundtrack to this rebel generation of black youth, had a huge influence on British youth subcultures. Bob Marley, of course, became the first ever global superstar from a third world country, and within Britain in the 1970s the punk youth subculture was also heavily influenced by the Jamaican reggae and ska sounds. So people like this guy, DJ Don Letts, took reggae to punk clubs, and bands such as The Clash incorporated these Jamaican influences into their own sound. Now in the 1980s, African Caribbean music becomes less concerned with reflecting the political and spiritual themes that we associated with roots reggae and Rastafarian culture. So the dancehall scene, which was popular in Jamaica, began to be seen in the UK in the 1980s in those areas of the country that had high concentrations of Jamaican immigrants. And in these dancehall clubs, DJs were accompanied by MCs. And in the 1990s, a new sound came about in the UK which emerged out of this dancehall scene. And this new type of music was called jungle music, which was a combination of drum and bass sounds with ragga-style MCs talking over the top. And this sound was put out on pirate radio stations and at jungle raves. So this started out as an underground musical movement. Now in the early 2000s, the jungle scene started to die down and also split into different directions, such as the drum and bass scene. And in the late 2000s, another new musical style emerged, which was influenced by both garage, drum and bass, dancehall, and also American hip-hop. And this new musical genre came to be known as grime music. So this originated in the East End of London and spread through the musical underground again, through things like pirate radio stations and the internet. And the guy on the screen, who I'm sure you'll recognise, Dizzy Rascal, was one of the first grime artists to gain commercial success for this style of music. So grime music is a genre and a musical scene that we'll analyse in much more detail later on in the course.